be to God. You may all be seated. Let me begin this morning by making a bold statement, perhaps. And here it is. I believe that we as human beings, as humanity, have a very interesting and complicated understanding and therefore relationship with the concept of justice and mercy. We as humanity have a complicated and therefore difficult understanding and relationship with justice and mercy. I know we don't use Facebook anymore, but if we did, this would be the complicated relationship status on Facebook or whatever social media thing you use. I know you cringed, I'm old. I don't know the other stuff that y'all young people use, but that's how this works. Now, we're going to define them a little later, but let me show it to you this way, what I mean. Pastor Chung alluded to it a little while back, a couple months ago, but since it's Sunday, for whatever reason, on Sundays, we seem to get a hankering and a craving for Chick-fil-A, only to realize we can't go because it's Sunday and they're closed. So, if you're my family, the next best thing is Raising Cane's, chicken fingers. It's delicious. So let's say a family like mine, right, 5 people, two adults and 3 children, go to Raising Cane's and get chicken fingers. But 2 adults, and let's say our children are high school, they all love to eat, they're big eaters and so on and so forth. So what the parents do is they order themselves a modest meal, each a 3-finger meal. 3 chicken fingers, a cane sauce, fries, a Texas toast, and a drink. But the kids, because they eat a lot more than the parents, they all each get a caniac. Yes, 6 chicken fingers, Texas toast, fries, coleslaw, 2 cane sauces, and a larger drink. If that sounds ridiculous to you, trust me, my kids can eat a caniac by themselves. So then you order it, and you wait, and then the food comes out. And it comes out in this big old tray, 5 of these trays comes out, and then you take it to the table. And because the 3-finger meals are substantially smaller, you hand that out to the parents, you give it to the where you're sitting, and then you take the 3 caniacs, and then you hand it to your children. But right after you've handed it to them, one of the 3 kiddos gets super excited because he or she realizes that he or she just got an extra tender, so 7. But the parents didn't realize because when they look at the tray, it's so big and so many chicken fingers, you didn't even think to count. You just handed it out. And then immediately you hear, "Aw, lucky." Immediately followed by, "What the? That's not fair. How come so-and-so gets an extra one?" So parents, what do? Do you cut up the extra chicken finger into 3 even? Yes, defiant, yes, 3 even pieces and you hand it out? Or do you let the fortunate or lucky one keep the extra? And of course, if you're super Christian, you say there's no such thing as luck, and you call it a blessing. God has blessed you this day with an extra chicken finger. May you keep the favor and blessing of God upon you and enjoy your chicken finger. What do? Well, whatever you do, you are dealing with an issue of justice, equality, fair or unfair. Let me give you another example. Suppose that you are driving on I-10 or 610. This is 610, the highway here in Houston. Hopefully at a time it's less trafficy, but this happens to me quite often. As you're driving, usually at night, all of a sudden 2 or 3 cars zoom right by you in succession, going anywhere between 90 to 100 miles per hour. What goes on in your mind? Probably something like this. Man, if only the cops would actually do their job sometimes and catch the people who really speed, the people who actually endanger other people on the road, including themselves, only if they would actually do their job instead of not doing so on other occasions. And what you mean by this is simple. What you mean is, why don't they pull them suckers over instead of pulling people like me over? Because I only go 15 miles over the speed limit, aka 75 or 80, and those fools are going 90 or 100. Or just outside of here at church. Actually, this is a great example. If you're coming to church from east to west, aka around Med Center or City Center, you come off the highway onto the frontage. And as soon as you get on the frontage, how fast are you going? Usually, most likely 60 or 65, because that's how fast you're going on the highway. But then you immediately get pulled over. Why? Because did you know the speed limit out here is 45? By the way, it's a speed trap. Don't go 60. You'll get pulled over. But what happens if you get pulled over? Immediately as the officer comes up, you're pleading. You're like, "Officer, I wasn't actually really speeding. Can you just let me go with a warning, please? Because I wasn't going that fast. Officer, I'll be much more careful next time. I get it's 45. I didn't realize it. Can you just please let me go? All of these examples, what they're showing in truth is indeed that we have a distorted and complicated relationship with justice and therefore mercy, isn't it? Because regardless of whether the real speeders who are going 25 over the limit get a ticket, you who go 15, 10, or even 5 over the limit, justice requires that even if you go 1 over the limit, you shall get a ticket. That is the definition of justice, whether you like it or not. Just because we use finger quotes and say really speeding or actually speeding does not mean justice changes. It does not change as we feel appropriate. The reason our understanding and therefore relationship with justice and mercy is complicated is because in truth, on one hand, often we desire deeply equality and fairness. Everyone must get the same number of chicken fingers. How dare anyone not get what they're supposed to get? AKA, you cannot stand preferential treatment or inequality, but deep inside, you absolutely love and more so desire preferential treatment when it benefits you, of course. When I'm the one getting the extra chicken finger. And of course, the one sibling who got the extra chicken finger and had it cut up into 3 pieces, you are feeling injustice to the core. It's my extra blessing that you're sharing with other people. Forget being blessed for being a blessing. It's my chicken finger. Whether it's chicken fingers or anything else, this is how we are. If you're Korean like me, whenever you go to a chicken finger place or like fried chicken, this is Sunday. I eat fried chicken on Sundays most of the time. I love it. When you order a big old box of fried chicken, like 20, 25 pieces or whatever, do you know what you do? As soon as you get it, you open it up and you start counting. How many breasts did I get? How many thighs did I get? And if they dare miscount the number of thighs, you immediately go up, enraged, speed up to the thing. You hold your receipt, you point at it real hard. You said, I paid for X number amount and you didn't give me what I paid for. How dare you? You don't say those words, but that's what you're thinking. And you're expecting that they're going to not only make up and give you the right amount, but they should give you extra, because how dare they miscount my fried chicken? But what if you open up the box and they gave you 3 extra thighs? Does anyone go up to the register? I paid for 25, but you gave me 28. How dare you? Take it back. Nah. You go, oh, today is my, so not lucky, fortunate, blessed day. Suckers, more chicken for me. So which is it then? Justice or mercy? Well, as I said, it's complicated, isn't it? It depends, doesn't it? We like to move the needle whenever we feel like, as it pertains to us. Well, this complicated relationship with justice and mercy is exactly what the text is addressing today. Or more specifically, when it comes to God, do we desire a God of justice or a God of mercy? And you might go, wait, Pastor Peter, how come it can't be both? Does it necessarily have to be one or the other? Well, these questions and these issues and more are what we're going to get into today. So let's do so, shall we? Dive right in by setting the stage. Now, if you were here last week in the previous section, something monumental happened in the story of Abraham and Sarah. The final piece of the promise, the long-awaited covenant has finally been set. Why? Because the long-awaited son has been finally revealed. We now know exactly who the parents are going to be, both mom and dad, Abraham and Sarah. We also know the name of the son, Isaac. And we even know when he is going to be born in 1 year's time. So now, much of life for Abraham and Sarah feels settled, don't it? Right? There's things, and things are settled, and all the questions have seemingly been answered. All they got to do is wait 1 year. And so now that things are settled, it seems that God is wanting to make certain and clear some things with Abraham. That God is saying, you must be this way now that everything has been set. And the thing that he wants to make clear is simply righteousness and justice must be a defining characteristic of God's people, a lifestyle, if you will. Abraham, generation, and all the way on down, righteousness and justice must be their hallmark. What God is doing is adding another layer to what his chosen people are supposed to be. A few chapters ago, he established that all of God's people, the males anyway, need to submit to circumcision. But as we explained, it's not just circumcision of the foreskin, but circumcision of the heart. And if you remember from that passage, if you were unwilling to submit to said circumcision, well, then what was God going to do? He's going to cut you off from God's people appropriately. Well, another mark of God's people he's trying to establish are those indeed that will do righteousness and justice. What God is doing is making abundantly clear that Abraham is supposed to teach his children, and his children are supposed to teach their children, and so on and down forth. All the generations must do righteousness and justice. And perhaps more importantly, just like those who do not submit to circumcision, those who will not follow the way of the Lord of doing righteousness and justice, God makes clear simply will undoubtedly, without question, disqualify themselves from the covenant. Or better, they're going to be judged and therefore destroyed. So big implications here. You don't submit to circumcision, cut off. You're not going to walk in the way of righteousness and justice, you will disqualify yourself from the covenant. See yourself out. Now, we need to clarify that righteousness here does not mean perfection or being without sin, because that's impossible. But what God is saying is simple. There definitively must be a standard of righteous living of justice that must be followed, lest you disqualify yourself from being part of God's covenant people. You can kind of look at it as like the speed limit is 45, but you know what? You can go 5 over it. That's the standard. Maybe not perfection, but maybe just a little bit further. And to make sure that nobody is confused about what the standard is, luckily for us, or sorry, not luckily, fortunate for us, there's an example right there, Sodom and Gomorrah, a real-life case study of what this standard is going to be like. And the standard is simple. They need to be destroyed and judged. Why? Because their sins are exceedingly grave. Something we've known since chapter 13, actually. By the way, in Genesis and in Old Testament and other places, sin to God tends to scream out. It makes noises in many ways. The outcry, right? The author calls it. And so God has heard the great outcry of Sodom and Gomorrah, and we have to ask, what is God going to do about all this sin? Well, because God is a just God, and Sodom and Gomorrah are exceedingly wicked, God in verse 21 says, I'm going to go down, confirm, see to make sure that indeed their life matches the outcry that he's heard, and if it does indeed, he's going to destroy them. But if not, then he'll do something else. That's right, Asher. Amen. But there's an interesting wrinkle that's developing here. God, for whatever reason, decides to let Abraham know his plans for Sodom and Gomorrah. And he tells us why, actually. He goes, because through Abraham all the nations are going to be blessed, and if I judge Sodom and Gomorrah, well, that's one less nation that he's going to bless, and so he should know that this is going to happen. So, armed with this knowledge of what's going to happen, what does Abraham do? And this is where things get quite interesting. Abraham stands before God, and he begins to plead for Sodom and Gomorrah. He begins to, as some have suggested, negotiate, barter with God about how God will treat Sodom and Gomorrah. And then there are 6 rounds of negotiation, if you will. 6 times Abraham starts to negotiate with God on what God will do, and the rounds are highly, highly interesting. Let's break them down a little bit, okay? The first round lays out the issues and the terms. The first round is the most important. This is where you find all the information. And here they are, verses 23 and 26. Okay? Here's my translation of what happens here. Abraham goes, God, I know that you're a just God, and because you're a just God, you wouldn't actually wipe away all the righteous with the wicked, will you? You can't, can you? If you're just, you cannot, as a just God, treat the righteous the same as the wicked. No, that's not how this works, can you? And then he gives God the terms. So, if that is true, then suppose, God, that 50 righteous are found in the city. And let me be clear, it's 50 amongst the many, 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 thousands upon thousands. So even if 50 among the thousands are found, you're not going to wipe away the righteous with the wicked, will you? And it's interesting because it's a rhetorical question, essentially, because Abraham answers the question first. He goes, no, you won't. Far be it from you, he says. You won't. I know you won't. I mean, he's not that tone. He's being much nicer. And here what we see is Abraham is actually defining justice for God, and he does it on the money. Because justice, by definition, is getting what you deserve. It's simple. So the righteous, they live. Why? Because they don't deserve to die, but they deserve to live because they're righteous. But the wicked, they die. Why? Because they deserve to die for their exceedingly great sin. It's pretty simple. Now, it would be one thing, though, if Abraham, knowing this information, pleads to God for justice, a.k.a. keep the righteous alive, but you know what, the wicked? Yeah, you can destroy them because that's what they deserve. But you may have noticed, in an interesting twist of the plot there, that's not what Abraham does at all. No. What does he do? He pleads for the mercy of Sodom and Gomorrah. And mercy, by definition, as you see, is not getting what you deserve. So what he's pleading for is that the wicked, though they deserve death, do not get it and therefore are spared. Verse 24, he says, will you indeed sweep it away and not spare the place, the whole city, for the sake of the 50 righteous that are in it? So what Abraham's saying is, it doesn't matter how many wicked and how wicked they are. If they're 50, won't you spare the whole place? Won't you let the wicked benefit from the account of the righteous and get what they do not deserve on their own, but what the righteous have earned for them in many ways? Moses is flipping the whole scenario on its head. Do you see? And how does God respond? Verse 26, if I find 50, then I will spare the entire city on their account. God says yes. Now, before we move on, let me ask you, how do you feel about what God is doing, about what Abraham is doing? I'm going to presume that we got a little mixed feelings in here. Some of you are like, yeah, God, merciful God, that's the God I love, that's the God I want, that's the God I got. Some of you might be like, I don't, man, something feels a little, It's kind of like this, isn't it? Have you ever had this happen to you? You get put into a group project, usually about 6 to 8 people. And unfortunately, only 2 of the 6 to 8 people, they do all the work. They carry hard. And because they carried, the 6, they freeload, and they get the same results and the same credit and the same grade, whether it's school or work, as the 2 who did all the work. Now, depending on how you feel, it might reveal which role you've played in your life. Some of you in here, I guarantee you, have only ever played the 2 who carried role. You will never let yourself be the freeloaders. Nah, I can't. I'm not a freeloader. But some of you in here, be honest, you don't got to raise your hands. You freeloaded a time or 2. And if you have, you're like, yes, God, merciful God, I'm all about that, yeah. So how do you feel? Hold on to that, because we'll need it for later. Now, rounds 2 and 6 go much faster. Now that the issues have been set and the terms have been set, they just go like this, really quickly. Round 2, verse 28. What about 45? You're not going to destroy the whole city based on 45, will you? God says, no, I will not destroy if I find 45. Round 3, verse 29. Suppose 40 are found. I will not do it on the count of the 40. Round 4, verse 30. Suppose 30 are found. God, I will not do it if I find 30. Round 5, verse 31. Suppose 20 are found. I will not destroy on account of the 20. And then round 6, verse 32. Suppose 10 are found, God. God says, I will not destroy on account of the 10. Boom, 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 boom. Right down to 10. Now, 2 things we have to notice to really understand what's going on here. First, in the beginning, the first 4 rounds of this negotiation, God responds using the same words that Abraham uses. Round 1, will you not spare on account of 50? God says, I will spare on account of 50. Round 2, will you destroy because of a difference of 5? God says, I will not destroy because of 45. Round 3, suppose 40. Abraham's done saying all the words. He goes, what about 40? God says, I won't do it. Round 4, what about 30? I won't do it. God is matching Abraham word for word, kind of intensity for intensity. But then the last 2 rounds, interestingly, things change a bit. Round 5 and 6, Abraham says the same thing. Suppose 20, suppose 10, very short, just as he did in the past 2. But God all of a sudden says, I will not destroy on account of 20. I will not destroy on account of 10. God brings up the intensity. He's no longer matching Abraham anymore. It's almost as if God is kind of bristling at the idea of this number getting lower and lower. So he's bringing up the intensity almost as if to suggest, don't push it. Abraham, don't push it. So Abraham indeed doesn't push it. First thing you got to notice. The next thing you got to notice is Abraham's deference. In verse 27, 30, 31, and 32, Abraham understands what he's doing. Abraham understands he's making big moves and asking big things about God. So what does he do? He generally tends to defer and say, God, I'm so sorry. I know I shouldn't speak, but I'm speaking. Thank you, so on and so forth. He says these things over and over and over again. What Abraham is suggesting is that he knows he's a sinner, and he knows he has no right to negotiate with a holy and perfect God, and yet God is listening. Why? Because God is like that. And so Abraham makes notes throughout. He says, I'm but ashes and dust. May you not be angry. I venture to speak, so on and so forth. And then when he feels like God's limit is being tested and pushed, he says, I shall only speak this one last time, God. Just one time. What about 10? Abraham understands that he's pushing things, and he's pushing God's mercy, perhaps. And so he continually humbles himself and says, God, I know you don't have to. I'm just asking, what about? So let me ask you again. How are you feeling? Where are you landing? Should God be just? Or should God be merciful? Or are you still like, why not both? Well, here's why not both. Because fundamentally, technically speaking, mercy and justice are incompatible with the other. To be merciful by definition is to not be just, and to be just is to not dispense mercy by definition. You kind of can't be both. And yet, what we find is that Abraham, while appealing to God as a just God, right? He says, shall not the judge of all the earth deal justly? While appealing to God's justice, he pleads for mercy. Is Abraham dumb? No, he's not. So what is he doing? So if we're being honest, then we might feel a little mixed inside as to how we feel about a God of justice or a God of mercy. But in case you're not mixed, one more thing you must consider to really decide how you feel, and that is how wicked Sodom and Gomorrah actually is. For the little ones in here, I'll try to not be as vulgar, but this is a vulgar passage, just warning you. Chapter 18 and 19 of Genesis, I suggest you go home and read it. It's actually a 24-hour period, a very short, brief period in the life of Abraham and Sarah. And it begins in chapter 18, verse 1, with these mysterious figures appearing to Abraham. And Abraham immediately, what does he do? He says, I have these guests. Let's extend hospitality. So he goes, Sarah, let's make these cakes. He prepares a lavish meal, and so on and so forth. He extends great hospitality. This is a very important thing, although it may not seem it, because back in the ancient times, in the ancient world, hospitality was definitively one of the characteristics of righteous and good people. If you're a good person, you extended hospitality. It's what you did. So if you didn't extend hospitality, then that means you were a wicked and not so righteous person. So Abraham extends hospitality in the very beginning. Well, at the end of chapter 18, right, that we just read, the two visitors are now going to go to Sodom. So in the beginning of chapter 19, the only person that welcomes him is Lot, Abraham's nephew. And he says, hey, why don't you come home with me, so we can make sure you guys can rest, all that kind of stuff. They first initially deny, but then Lot kind of pleads and say, okay, we'll go with you. But then things get real spicy. As soon as they get to Lot's house, the men of Sodom and Gomorrah, they all gather together like an army of them, and then they surround Lot's house. I know, very ominous. They start banging on the door, essentially, and they're like, I know 2 strangers went into your house. Bring them out here right now. And you know what they want to do? Again, vulgar. I'll try to keep it as PG as possible. He goes, bring them out here so we can have relations with them. That's code word for a word that begins with R and ends in E. Figure it out. We want to so-and-so with them. Bring them out here right now. By the way, this is men on men stuff. So you know what Lot does? Oh, no, can't have that. These are my guests. You know what he does? He says no, thankfully, but then what he does next is super strange. He goes, here, no, don't take the men. Have my daughters. My daughters, they're married, but they haven't had a relationship with anybody, and you can do whatever you want with them. Yeah, I know. The Bible's spicy. And the man goes, no, that's not what we want. We want the men. So things start to kind of escalate and things like that, but then eventually they are able to flee. But as they flee, interesting things happen. As they're given a chance to flee this craziness and wickedness, Lot's sons-in-law, you know what they say? Nah, we ain't going. We like this place. This is our home. We're with them. So they go back. But as they're leaving, they're given instructions by these men that as they leave the city, don't look back. It ain't worth looking back. Don't long for something that you shouldn't have in the first place. So as they leave, it's Lot, Lot's wife, and his 2 daughters. You know what happens? Lot's wife looks back. And you know what happens to her? Immediately she turns into a pillar of salt. And then it gets even more strange, even more vulgar in many ways. Then Lot and his 2 daughters make it out. And after they made it out, Lot's daughters realize, wait a minute, I no longer have a husband. I can't have no sons. My legacy is ruined. So you know what they do? They get their father drunk. And the older one lays with him, gets pregnant. Next day, repeat. Younger one lays with father after he gets drunk. They trick him and then have a child. Those 2 children become the heads of a nation called Moab and Ammonites. 2 despicable and wicked nations in the history of the Old Testament. So much going on. But let me ask you the question again. Now that you know the kind of city Sodom and Gomorrah is, how do you feel that Abraham is pleading for their mercy? How do you feel that God is willing to give them mercy if he is able to find just 10 righteous in the city? How do you feel that God is willing to save people like that? Maybe more so, the question we must ask is, what does this mean? Wait, how does this work? How is God, our God, a just and good God, able to do that? How does God bring justice and mercy together if they are in truth incompatible with the other? Here's how. You may have had this inkling as you were reading the text, as we were kind of going through the rounds, and you may have thought, wait a minute, how come Abraham stops at 10? Did you think that? Because the logical conclusion to this negotiation is what? What about 5? No. What about 1, God? If God was willing to go to 10, why not go all the way to 1? Now, we've suggested that there seems to be limits to this sort of thing, and maybe the limit perhaps is 10 righteous amongst thousands and thousands. Although the ratio is heavily skewed, obviously many, many more wicked and just 10 righteous, but maybe that's the limit. For the sake of 10, the many will be spared. And I think this makes sense to some degree. Remember the early example, the 2 out of the group of 8 that carries, right? Most of us would be like, man, that kind of sucks, but you know what, that's life. Maybe that's how you reacted to it. That's kind of how I react to it. But what if that group wasn't 8? What if it was 2 who carry for the entire group of 25? Or what if the group is 50? Or 100? And so on and so forth. I think all of us in here be like, wait a minute, just wait 1 second. You and your sense of justice is probably being stirred. Be like, there's no way 2 should carry for 25, let alone 50. No way for 100. All the right-minded people in here would be like, take those 2 people. If that's them, you'd be like, yo, you need to speak up. You would advocate for them. And there's no way you should let your teachers or your bosses or whoever let them get away with stuff like that. That's not cool. People should pull their weight. Justice, equality, fairness. So why not get past 10? And here's why. I think what God is suggesting is that no matter how righteous the 9 or 5 would be, there's no way that the righteousness of a 1 can cover and offset the wickedness of this Sodom and Gomorrah. There's no way, no matter how righteous 9 or 5 or what, no matter what, they're still not perfect. And so no matter what, God must be just as the eternal just judge of all the people. And because of that, he has to stop somewhere. But I think more so, this is what's happening. I think he has to stop at 10. Because ultimately, God is pointing us to look at what is to come in the end. What this story has always been pointing to and what it will forever point to. If you've been here with us, we've said this entire time, this entire story of Abraham, this narrative, has always been pointing to what? The son. But not Isaac. No, Jesus. The long-awaited, the one and promised son who's going to fulfill every promise that God has ever made, not just in Genesis, but in the entire time. And what is in the end long-attended ultimate purpose for this long-awaited son of promise? Isn't it justice, mercy, and grace for all of the world, including those who disqualified themselves with all their wickedness from the covenant? By the way, as you read the section from the beginning, it's basically known. God knows. There's no 50, let alone 10, righteous in the city. And yet God allows Abraham to plead for them. Why? And this is where you have to understand how you feel. Remember those questions? The reason why he lets Abraham appeal and plead for them is because that is the heart of the gospel, isn't it? That's the whole redemption plan of humanity, isn't it? If you remember from the beginning of this series, we said that Genesis 1 through 11 is the first half of the Bible. 12 through the rest is the rest of the Bible, second half. If you look in the first half, what happens? There's two things that happens that's very similar to this. It's called the flood, and it's also called Tower of Babel. Well, interesting, in the flood, God says similar things. I'm going to go down and see, and then if it is, I'm going to wipe the whole place away. And indeed, does wipe it all away, except for Noah and his family. Well, in this beginning of the second half, after he promises never do it again, what does he do? He chooses Abraham, the one chosen person, to be the representation for this story of redemption for the rest of the world. This is the reason why the whole story has been pointing not to Isaac, but the true son of Abraham, the true son who is indeed Jesus. And what is it that Jesus does in the end? He, the one and only true righteous one, the only one that's sinless and therefore perfect, on account of him, every single wicked person in the world is not destroyed, but rather spared. From the jump, the plan of God was always to advocate for the mercy of the wicked on account of the righteous, of the one whose name is Jesus. And here I think what God is saying is, I will not entertain the idea that there might be even one in the city of Sodom, because the one that can only do this, he is to come, and just not yet, but his name is Jesus. Now, some of you might say, wait, Pastor Pete. Not so fast. Cool, Jesus is cool. But how does this explain justice and mercy? How do they they're not compatible still. This doesn't really change anything. Well, it does, actually. Because in and through Jesus is the only way you can make justice and mercy compatible. How? Via this thing that you know. It's called the cross. You know, the cross, interestingly, is one of, if not, actually, no, let me put it. The cross is absolutely the most confounding thing about our faith and about the gospel. Do you know why? The cross is the symbol, the representation of everything that is good, lovely, beautiful, right, wonderful, and amazing about our faith. Would you agree? But at the same time, it is actually the instrument of gruesome capital punishment, the instrument of death, perhaps the worst in the entire history of humanity. How do those things square? I've said this before. Imagine wearing electric chairs on your ears. That sounds dumb, doesn't it? Yeah, that's exactly what you're doing. That's what the cross is. So why does that work then? It's because on the cross, God, the just God, takes all of his justice and therefore his wrath, all the punishment, all the death, scorn, and shame of sin on who? On Jesus. And therefore, because he dispensed his justice on the one righteous, the only one that can cover for all the world, because he's actually perfect, then he opens the door for all the wicked in the world to receive what I'm calling just mercy. Mercy that is just and fair in every single way. It's the only way this works. Listen to the way that Paul describes it in Romans 3:23, 26. He says, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God. That's you and me. All of us, wicked sinner, falling short of God's glory. Being justified as a gift of his grace through the redemption which is in Christ Jesus, whom God displayed publicly as a propitiation in his blood through faith. This was to demonstrate his righteousness, because in God's merciful restraint, he let the sins previously committed go unpunished for the demonstration, that is, of his righteousness at the present time, so that he would be just and the justifier of the one who has faith in Jesus Christ. Here's what this means. All along, all the sins of the world, God has essentially let it go unpunished. He didn't forget. Why? So that that punishment that all those sins deserved wouldn't go on them, but rather would go on Jesus, poured on him. Why? So that everybody would know that God is just. He did not overlook the sins. He's not just willy-nilly saying sins are okay, Sodom and Gomorrah. No. He's not doing that. All of that justice and wrath and punishment goes on God himself, the holiness of his Son, Jesus Christ. So that you and I, who are wicked and sinful, do not have to receive it, but rather receive mercy that we do not deserve. Now let me ask you, isn't this what the gospel is all about? You and I, the wicked, who receive undeserved mercy on behalf of the death of the righteous, on account of the righteous one. Do we know that this is who we are? Wicked sinners who should have rightly and therefore justly received death for our sin, but who, because of God's goodness, because he is a just and merciful God, allows them the righteous blood of the Lamb that should not have been spilt to wash and cleanse us of our sin. Now, if you've been in church a long time, you probably have heard this many times, and maybe it's not moving you, but let me finish by perhaps allowing us to allow it to move us. Because I think it moves us to respond in a way that only the gospel does. So how do we respond? Well, interestingly, the word for spare, right, that Abraham and God uses, will you not spare the whole city, can also be translated, the Hebrew can, into the word forgive. There it is. Will you not forgive the whole city on the account of the righteous? Now, the idea of forgiveness in the Bible is generally and most often tied to the notion of debt, canceling of debt. So someone owes you, and then you cancel it, aka you eat the debt, which is not pleasant, but indeed, that's what happens. That's why in the version of the Lord's Prayer that we recite, because some do it this way, it says, forgive us our debts as we have forgiven our debtors. Others say, forgive us our sins and forgive those who have sinned against us. They're interchangeable, debt and sin. That's how. But you may know this, although we don't recite it because it's not a part of the prayer. Do you know what Jesus says right after the prayer in Matthew 6? For if you forgive other people for their offenses, your heavenly Father will also forgive you. But if you do not forgive other people, then your heavenly Father will not forgive your offenses. Now, to be clear, the idea isn't this idea that if you can't forgive, you're not saved. No. But here's what it is, the idea. What God is saying, what Jesus is saying is this. If you can't, or better, if you aren't willing to forgive someone who's clearly sinned against you, then you have not clearly understood what it took for Jesus to forgive you. You, therefore, do not understand God's justice, mercy, and grace, because you can't, therefore, give it. So here's how we then respond. I think the response is pretty simple. I think our call is to, like Abraham, plead, pray, dare, barter, and negotiate with God for the mercy of the many people who have hurt you. The people who deep inside, if we're being honest, that we hate. People that make us cringe because they've hurt us so bad. Why? Because mercy and justice are all a part of forgiveness. Here's how I learned it. Justice, as we've said, is getting what you deserve. Simple. Mercy is not getting what you deserve. Well, grace is getting what you do not deserve. We, sinners, deserve death. We didn't get it. That's justice and mercy. But we also get eternal life, unity, love, joy, peace, goodness, kindness, gentleness, all these things from the Spirit. And we are getting that which we do not deserve. And because we don't deserve this death, or because we don't receive this death, but rather receive mercy and grace, then the way and the only way to respond is that we would then seek the same thing for those who've sinned against us. That we would plead for the mercy of those who've hurt us to not get justice, but no, rather mercy and grace, because they too, as we have, ought not because they deserve it, because God is so good, get the grace they do not deserve. Are you willing to pray for the mercy and grace of those who hurt you, to cancel their debts though they owe you big time? We have a complicated relationship with justice and mercy. If it's up to us, I'll just put it this way. If it's up to me, I would love for God to give me mercy. But all those who've wronged me, oh, they get justice. You feeling like that? Well, if that's the case, then you and I, we don't want the gospel to work, because it cannot work that way. Because if the righteousness of the one is going to cover the wickedness of the many, then it must cover the wickedness of all, and not just the select few that we like, including ourselves and those we like. Will you, church, be like Abraham, the father of our faith, the father of Isaac, the father of Jesus, and the father of us that we've seen, who from the very beginning exemplified the faith of Christ, who exemplified the character of God's people, those who would then teach their children and their children and their children on down the generation that we would do righteousness and justice, but not in the way the world does it, no, but in the way that God does it, in a just mercy kind of way. Parents in the room, are you teaching your children the way of just mercy? Or do they find that you can't forgive, you hold grudges, you will not, unwilling to let go? Students in the room, your friends who've backstabbed you, talked behind your back, said mean things, whatever it may be, are you willing, because you are recipients of the gospel, to then give them the same grace? More so, are you willing to plead, put your neck out on the line and say, God, won't you? You're not actually going to destroy the wicked, will you? Won't you save them on the sake of the one who is righteous? People of the covenant, here's my prayer for you. May you always be those who receive the unimaginable forgiveness of Jesus, because he's the righteous one who covers all your wickedness, because he's the righteous who died for the wicked, and therefore on his account, may you always receive this mercy and grace, the forgiveness of God. But as you receive it, then may you give it. Not just because it may signal that if you're not willing that you have not received it from God, but more so this. Lewis Smedes, a theologian, says, to forgive is to set the prisoner free and to recognize that the prisoner is me. May you never be shackled by the bitterness and the hurt and the pain of not being able and willing to forgive others. May you be freed from that pain and punishment by receiving God's just mercy and therefore pleading and therefore being free from the chains of sin. May you look to the cross and know that he's shed his blood for you. And then in response, then pray that that same blood would wash those who need it most. May you walk outside of these doors and plead for the mercy of those who so desperately need it. And guess what? The ones who keep hurting you are the ones who need it most, because they clearly do not know God's forgiveness. May the glory of God and the grace of his Son and the love and the fellowship of the Spirit move you to pray like this, for it is not natural. But when you do, may you be free to love, because you've received just mercy and therefore are willing to give it in kind. Take some time. Perhaps think of the people God is calling you to forgive, and may you indeed give it to them freely, joyfully.